picture this. You're heading back to 1990. The Berlin Wall's just come down, right? MC Hammer's at the top of the charts, and no one wants to talk about domestic violence. It's just not something you brought up. It was a really different world. But that was the year that the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, was first introduced. And today we are going to deep dive into this landmark piece of legislation. We'll learn how it completely changed things for survivors and what still needs to be done.
I think it's so important to remember that VAWA wasn't just about laws and policies. It sparked a real cultural shift. It forced a national conversation on an issue that people just didn't talk about.
And to understand how big of a deal that is, we really need to think about what life was like before VLBO, right?
Imagine a world where police departments didn't have any specialized training on domestic violence cases. Shelters were really scarce, and legal aid was almost impossible to find. And there wasn't even a national hotline for victims to call for help.
It's hard to believe now that something like the National Domestic Violence Hotline didn't even exist until VOBO. It's become a lifeline for so many people. It's received over 7 million calls. That shows you how badly it was needed.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just the hotline. VOBO brought in so much needed federal funding. It created a whole infrastructure of support services for survivors. Shelters were expanded, legal aid programs were created, and law enforcement started getting specialized training. It was really widespread.
So how did this groundbreaking legislation even happen? Who were the people who made it happen?
Well, Senator Joe Biden played a crucial role. He championed VOBA right from the beginning. But his efforts were really fueled by years of advocacy from feminist and women's rights groups. These groups had been raising awareness about just how widespread domestic violence was, and they were really pushing for systemic change.
So it's a perfect example of how grassroots movements can lead to real change.
Definitely. And the impact wasn't just symbolic either. There was a study by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and they found that between 1993 and 2008, reported intimate partner violence against women dropped by 53%. That's huge. It really shows just how effective VIA has been at saving lives.
Wow, 53%. That's incredible.
Yeah.
But VIA wasn't a one-time fix, right?
Nope, not at all. It's been reauthorized 4 times since it was first introduced, and it's been adapted to address the changing nature of violence against women. That adaptability is one of its greatest strengths.
Let's talk about the most recent reauthorization, the one from 2022. I think this is going to be particularly interesting for our listeners in that 45 to 60 age group.
This reauthorization was really important because it addressed some really critical gaps in protection, especially for tribal communities and LGBTQ+ individuals.
The expansion of tribal jurisdiction was a big win for Native American women. For years, tribal courts couldn't prosecute non-Native people who committed violence on tribal lands. This reauthorization finally closed that loophole.
It was definitely long overdue. And the 2022 reauthorization also made real progress in supporting LGBTQ+ survivors. It recognized that they often face unique challenges when they're trying to find help.
And with technology becoming such a big part of our lives, it also addressed cyberstalking and revenge porn. Creating a national resource center to handle cybercrimes against individuals is so crucial in today's world.
Absolutely. And the fact that it now includes a federal civil cause of action for victims of non-consensual intimate image disclosure shows just how VRDWA is keeping up with the times and responding to these new forms of abuse that we see in the digital age.
But it's not all about reacting to new problems. The 2022 reauthorization also really emphasized prevention. They expanded education programs, including ones that target dating violence in higher education and offer support to kids who've been exposed to domestic violence.
That focus on prevention is so important. It's a real shift from just reacting to violence after it's happened to actively trying to stop it before it starts.
And this proactive approach fits perfectly with President Biden's national plan to end gender-based violence. This plan outlines 7 different strategies for dealing with the problem in a much more comprehensive way.
Exactly. Seeing that national plan come together really highlights the commitment to tackling this issue from all angles.
Speaking of big milestones, there was a really powerful 30th anniversary celebration for VOBA at the White House. They brought together survivors, activists, and some big names like Tarana Burke. She's the founder of the Me Too movement. It was a time to celebrate the progress they'd made and talk about the work that still needs to be done.
Yeah, hearing the stories from survivors was so moving. They shared how resilient they've been and how VOBA has impacted their lives. It was a powerful reminder of the human cost of this issue and how important it is to keep fighting for justice and support for survivors.
And having someone like Tarana Burke there really emphasizes how VOA has become part of a much larger conversation about respect consent and challenging the ways power works in our society.
It's a good reminder that violence against women isn't a women's issue. It's a societal issue that needs everyone to work together if we want to fix it.
It's amazing to think about how far VA has come since it was first introduced in 1990. There's no doubt that it's made a huge difference in the lives of survivors of gender-based violence.
It really has. But like any complex social problem, there's still a lot of work to do. We've still got challenges ahead.
Which leads us perfectly into our next segment.
Yeah.
We're going to look at some specific cases that show the real impact of VAWA on people's lives.
Oh.
These stories will show how the law is actually used, and they'll show you all the different situations it covers.
And by doing that, I think we'll be able to understand the human stories behind all the statistics and legal jargon. It'll make it much more real. So welcome back to our deep dive into the Violence Against Women Act. Now that we've talked about the background, it's time to see VAWA in action. Sometimes all that legal stuff just doesn't really show you how much of an impact it has. So we're going to look at some real-life cases.
Yeah, because behind all those numbers, there are real people. And hearing their stories can really make you understand why VOA is so important.
Exactly. So let's start with a case that shows how VOA can give people both immediate safety and long-term support. This is the story of Jane Doe. She was in this really awful cycle of abuse. Her partner was controlling her emotionally, physically, and even financially.
Before VOA, so many women like Jane felt like they were stuck, like there was nowhere to go. But VOA gave Jane options that just didn't exist before.
It did. With VAWA, Jane was able to get a protective order. And that wasn't just about having something legal to use against her abuser, it also gave her a real sense of security. Knowing that he couldn't legally come near her or even contact her, that made a huge difference.
And VO didn't stop there. It also helped Jane connect with a local domestic violence shelter, a place where she could be safe, get counseling, and start to rebuild her life.
That kind of support network is so important. The shelter gave Jane access to all kinds of things, support groups, job training, and help finding resources that she never would have known about. It's a great example of how VOA's impact goes way beyond the courtroom.
Jane's case really shows how VOA empowers survivors by giving them both that immediate protection and the long-term support they need to escape the cycle of abuse.
Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about stalking. Sarah's story is really scary. It shows just how terrifying and invasive stalking can be.
It's a crime that doesn't always get enough attention, but it can have a devastating effect on people's lives.
For sure. In Sarah's case, her ex-boyfriend just became obsessed with her after they broke up. He was constantly following her, calling and texting her all the time. He even showed up at her work. It was just this constant state of fear and anxiety for her.
I can't imagine having to live with that kind of fear. And before VOA stalking was treated like it was no big deal, victims didn't have many legal options.
That's true. VA really changed things. Stalking is now recognized as a serious crime, and people like Sarah have much stronger legal protection. So in Sarah's case, VAOA allowed her to get a restraining order against her stalker. And finally, she had some peace of mind. She felt like she had some control over her own safety.
But it wasn't just about the legal side of things. VOA also provided funding for law enforcement training, which is huge. Police and prosecutors need to be able to recognize stalking behavior and know how to respond effectively.
You're absolutely right. And this is where VA has made a big difference. Laws are important, but you need the systems and the training in place to make sure those laws are actually being used.
These cases have been really powerful.
Yeah.
But let's look at one more. Maria's story shows the challenges that immigrant survivors often face. She was undocumented and she was terrified of being deported. On top of that, she was being abused by her husband.
Maria's case is really heartbreaking because her immigration status made her even more vulnerable. A lot of abusers take advantage of that fear of deportation to maintain control. It's a really common and awful tactic.
It reminds us that a lot of survivors have to deal with all these complicated legal and personal obstacles when they try to get help. But VIA law takes these unique vulnerabilities into account, and it offers specific protections for immigrant survivors.
Right. One of the most important things it offers is the U visa. This gives victims of certain crimes a way to gain legal status, and that includes domestic violence. For someone like Maria, this could change her whole life.
It really did. Maria was able to get a U visa, which meant she could stay in the country legally, and eventually she even became a citizen. Knowing that she wasn't constantly at risk of being deported was a huge relief. It gave her the chance to rebuild her life.
It's a great example of how VOL recognizes that different communities have different needs and tries to offer solutions that fit those needs. It understands that there's not a one-size-fits-all way to deal with violence against women.
These three cases, Jane, Sarah, and Maria, they're just a few examples of the countless lives that have been changed by VIA law. Each story is different, but they all highlight how this law gives hope and real solutions to survivors.
And it's important to remember that these aren't just random events. These stories reflect how VAWA has brought about real systemic change. It's about changing the laws, changing people's attitudes, and creating a society that supports survivors.
It's about changing the whole culture that allowed this type of abuse to hide in the shadows for so long.
Exactly. But like we've been saying, even with all this progress, there are still big challenges ahead.
Yeah, passing a law is one thing, but making sure it's actually working and reaching everyone who needs it, that's a whole other battle.
That's a great point, and that's what we'll talk about in our next segment. We'll look closer at those ongoing challenges and see what the future might hold for VOA.
We've heard some really inspiring stories about how VOA is making a difference, but you're right, there are still obstacles. What are some of the biggest challenges that are preventing us from really achieving VOA's goals?
Well, one of the biggest and most persistent challenges is funding. VAIA lays out all these amazing programs and services, but there's often not enough money to actually make them work. Shelters are way too crowded. Legal aid services are stretched way too thin, and specialized services for certain types of abuse or for specific communities, those are often missing, especially in rural areas or communities that are already underserved.
So even when the law itself is good, there are problems with actually putting it into practice.
Exactly. And even when you have really strong laws, there can be a lot of inconsistency in how they're enforced. There are still parts of the country where police and prosecutors just don't understand domestic violence very well, or where cultural biases can affect how they handle cases. And that can mean that victims aren't taken seriously, charges aren't filed, or abusers don't face any consequences. It's a real problem.
It sounds like education and training are key here,
Right.
not just for law enforcement, but for everyone who's part of the system.
Definitely judges, healthcare providers, social workers, anyone who might come into contact with a victim needs to be trained to spot the signs of abuse and know how to respond the right way.
And we can't forget about the politics of it all. VLEA's faced a lot of pushback over the years, even when they're just trying to reauthorize it.
Yeah, that's true. Some of the most heated debates have been around things like tribal jurisdiction and whether LGBTQ plus individuals should be included. These political battles can sometimes end up weakening the law. They have to make compromises.
So what can we do about all this? How do we make sure that VLEA stays strong and keeps making a difference?
We have to keep advocating for it. We can't just sit back and relax. We have to keep pushing our elected officials to make sure VLUA has enough funding to push for better enforcement and to close any loopholes that are still in the law.
It sounds like raising public awareness is a big part of that, too.
For sure. We need to keep talking about these issues,
Yeah.
challenge the harmful attitudes that are out there, and support the organizations that are doing the hard work on the front lines.
So looking forward, what do you think the future holds for VOA? Where do we go from here?
I think one really positive development is the increased focus on prevention. The 2022 reauthorization put a lot more emphasis on funding programs that tried to address the root causes of gender-based violence, things like challenging gender stereotypes, teaching kids about healthy relationships, and creating a culture where people respect each other and understand consent.
So instead of just reacting to violence, we're trying to prevent it from happening in the first place?
Yeah,
That seems like a much more effective way to approach the problem.
you're exactly right. And technology is playing a bigger and bigger role, too. It's creating new challenges, but it's also giving us new tools.
Yeah.
We have to find ways to deal with online harassment and abuse, but we can also use technology to connect survivors with the resources and support they need.
It's almost like a digital arms race.
You could say that, but there's also a growing understanding of how all these different forms of oppression overlap. That means recognizing that things like race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, and immigration status, all these things can make certain groups more vulnerable.
So it's not just about recognizing that different survivors face different challenges. It's about coming up with solutions that take those differences into account.
Exactly. We have to work together across all these different areas: law enforcement, healthcare, social services, education. We have to create a safety net that catches everyone who falls through the cracks.
VAWA has given us a strong foundation, but there's still a lot to do.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. But I'm hopeful. We've made huge progress since 1990, and if we stay committed and keep raising awareness, I think we can create a world where gender-based violence is a thing of the past. I really believe that.
That's a powerful vision. It's definitely worth fighting for. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for this deep dive into the Violence Against Women Act. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the history and the impact of VAWA, as well as the challenges that are still out there and the possibilities for the future. We hope you found this conversation informative and that it's given you some things to think about.
And as always, we encourage you to keep learning and exploring. We've included some resources in the episode notes if you'd like to dig deeper into this topic or find out how to get involved.
So until next time, keep asking questions, keep the conversation going, and let's all work together to create a world where everyone can live free from violence and fear.